In tonight's video, I'm going to be doing a video review of my Hobart 210 MVP MIG welder. And I bought this about 10 years ago now. It still works just as well as the day I bought it. Is this the right welder for you? Let's talk about it. So before we get into the actual review, I want to talk about the importance of knowing how to weld. Welding is such an important skill to have. Now, I remember when I was a little kid, my stepfather always had a MIG welder, a Miller MIG welder, and I always told him, "Hey, Pop, can you teach me how to weld?" And I don't know if he didn't know how to weld or he just didn't have time to teach me, so I eventually got tired of waiting. One day I just went out there and I taught myself how to weld. Now, nowadays you have the YouTube and you can learn how to do anything. Welding can be dangerous. Just make sure you understand the dangers of welding and you know how to do it properly so you don't electrocute yourself, yada yada yada. But welding is such an important and versatile skill. You can do automotive repairs, you can do repairs for friends, there's always metal parts that are breaking. You can sell arts and crafts projects. In fact, one of my previous more popular videos is how to make money with used horseshoes, and I actually use this welder to make little arts and crafts projects out of used horseshoes, and I actually made a decent amount of money selling those little artsy-fartsy projects. So having a welder, if you have the space for it, is just such an important thing to have. Now, when it comes to learning how to weld, a lot of the old-timers will tell you, you got to learn how to weld on a stick welder. Well, there's three processes. There's a stick welder where you have the big electrode on the battery clamp, which I have one of those inside. There's also a MIG welder, a wire-fed welder, which there's this little piece of wire going through this little hood right here, and the wire comes out at controlled speed and you control the voltage. And there's also TIG welding, and TIG welding is where you have a little TIG torch and then you feed the wire in manually. So there's really three different processes. There's also some other processes too, but those are the three main processes. Now again, the old timers told you that if you wanted to learn how to weld, you had to do it with a stick welder. Here's my opinion. If you have access to a stick welder and you don't have to pay for that machine, absolutely try and learn on a stick welder. But if you only have the money to invest in one machine, I'd kind of recommend you stay away from the stick welder. I think you're better off investing that money in a MIG welder. I think MIG is the most versatile, unless you're doing a lot of thin stuff. If you're doing a lot of thin stuff, then you probably want to go with a TIG welder, which we're not really going to talk too much about TIG welding. Now, they do make multi-process machines. Nowadays, they make machines that can do all three of those processes. But in my opinion, the issue with those machines, they're kind of like the jack of all trades, right? They can do each process, but I don't think they do each process as well as, say, a dedicated MIG welder. So if you only have the money to invest in one machine, of course make sure the machine meets your project, your needs. For me, I think this is an awesome first welder to start out on. Now, when it comes to MIG welders, one of the biggest problems you'll run into is, do you want to buy a machine that runs on 110 voltage, which plugs into a standard outlet, or do you want to buy a machine that can only run on 220 or 230 voltage? Well, the wonderful thing about this machine is this can run on dual voltages. That's why it's an MVP. MVP stands for multi-voltage plug. So this plug actually untwists, and you can swap out the 110 plug. Now, I know what you're asking. Why would you want a machine that can do 110 and 220 or 230? Why would you want that? Well, here's the thing. When you're doing bigger projects, you want to have more voltage. This machine runs really well on 220 when I'm doing assembly projects, like making this cart or making the wood crane cart. So you really want to have a machine that can use 230 for those types of projects. However, there are certain times where that 220 plug isn't going to be available. Maybe you don't have that outlet plumbed in your garage, or in my case, about a year ago now, I had the flapper valve inside my fireplace flue break away. I don't have a 220 volt plug inside, and it was very thin metal, so I swapped that to this 110 outlet, plugged it right into the socket in the wall, and I was able to do the repair myself. So it's awesome to have a machine that can run on 110 and 230. Alright, now let's talk about the face of the machine. So on the face of the machine, you have your on-off switch, which we don't have it connected to any power right now. You have an overheat light, so in case it gets too hot out, the machine will automatically shut off to prevent overheating. This is your ground connection. This tube right here, this is your connection. So this tube houses two things. For one, it houses that wire that's fed through there, And it also has a channel for shielding gas to run through that line. So that line's very important. You want to make sure that you don't bend it too tight or run over it. Try and really take care of this line if you can. And then we have two control knobs. So with a MIG welder, you have these two adjustments. The top one is your wire speed, and that controls how fast the wire comes out the head. Now, the nice thing about this machine is the wire speed is invariable. You can adjust it to any point you like, and you can really set this to where you want to set this. Now, one thing I dislike about this machine, it's simplistic, but I wish there was more adjustability. You only have these click settings for voltage. And that gets a little bit annoying sometimes, because sometimes you really want to tune this in and like you want the voltage between 4 and 5, and you can absolutely get by with this. What you just have to do, it's not a huge deal, it just takes a lot of practice, is if the puddle's running a little bit too hot, then all you have to do is turn up your wire speed a little bit more and maybe push a little bit faster, or you can go the opposite way. You can turn the voltage down and turn the wire speed down, and then slow it down a little bit. So it'd be nice to have a little bit more adjustability, but this works absolutely fine. You just have to get a little bit of experience, and you have to learn the machine in order to use it properly. Now on the side of the machine, you have this big compartment. Now what happens in this compartment? Well, first things first, this is where the spool of wire goes. Now this will accept up to a 10-pound spool of wire, which I think they come as small as maybe 1 and 2 pound. I always elect to go with the 10-pound spools. I used to buy those spools at Harbor Freight all the time, but they're just as cheap to buy them online now. Now, here's something really important that you need to understand when it comes to MIG welders. There's two types of wire. There's solid wire, which I have solid wire in this machine right now. The thing with solid wire, it produces cleaner looking welds. However, you also have to have a shielding gas. In this case, I believe this is a 75-25, 75% CO2, 25% argon, I think. So basically, the advantage to running solid core wire is you run really clean welds, as long as you're a good welder. The disadvantage is you have to pay the additional expense of shielding gas, which the cost of the wire, solid core wire versus flux core wire, probably about the same, but you know, of course you have the added expense of the shielding gas. Now, what is flux core wire? Well, flux core wire is a little bit different. You can see the solid core wire has like that coppery look to it, as where the flux corded wire has kind of like a silver shine over it, and basically you have the similar looking wire, except it's encapsulated with shielding dust or something like that. So basically what happens as you weld with that flux corded wire, it shields and protects that weld from oxidation and contaminants. Now, it's dirtier, it doesn't weld as smooth, it's great for farm repairs and stuff like that. It's just a cheaper process. It doesn't look as nice, but it's functional and it's cost effective. But if you're looking for those really clean, pretty welds, you're going to want to stick with the solid core wire and a good quality shielding gas. Now, when it comes to this wire, I believe it comes in two different thicknesses. Now, there's 0.030 and 0.035. And now, typically, I like to run the smaller wire because that suits my needs better, because smaller wire is better for thinner metals, as where the 0.035 is a thicker wire, and that's good if you're doing like a lot of thick metal repair, farm repair, stuff like that. So when you switch between the two wires, there's actually a little spool here with two different grooves. Now, if you have the smaller wire, obviously you want it on the smaller groove, and if you're using the bigger wire, then you gotta, of course, use the bigger groove. But in order to change this, quarter turn pops right out. Insert this dial back in, quarter turn to the right. Of course, you'd flip-flop it, but that's pretty simple. In addition to that, you have an adjustable tensioner right here. So if you find that your wire isn't feeding out of your gun properly, it could be one thing, it could be a few things. You could have a clogged up tip, which we'll go over the tip in a moment, but it could also be that you don't have the right amount of tension on the wire because there's an electric motor that feeds that wire. So if you don't have the proper amount of tension, then that wire is not going to feed properly. Another really important thing that we need to discuss here is polarity. Now, when you're running solid core wire, you need to have, it's called DCEP, which stands for electropositive wire. which if I understand that correctly, it means that the wire is positively charged and the piece is negatively is grounded. As where flux corded wire, you need to reverse the polarity. So if I understand it correctly, the wire becomes the ground, and the grounding clamp actually becomes the positive current side, if I understand that correctly. I think I do. But whenever you switch between the two of them, in order to change the polarity of the machine, what you need to do is unbolt this bolt, and just swap these connections. Now, there is good high quality stranded copper wire, but the connections, they look a little bit cheap. I wish they used a higher quality copper connector. Just my opinion. And when I go to tighten these down, I mean, it's just in this plastic housing. It's probably good because it shields you a little bit from the potential of like an electric shock, because I'm sure there's a big capacitor in here. But, you know, it works. You know, one of the first projects I did with this MIG welder was actually to make this welding cart, because if you're going to be running solid core wire, you got to have that shielding gas, and you need a place to put that shielding gas. Yes, you can buy a commercial cart, but I wanted to make my own. And this cart has been pretty darn good for what it is. I wish I chose higher quality casters, but that's about it. I do have the plasma cutter underneath the welder because I find myself using that all the time. But let's continue to talk about this machine. So when you buy this machine, it comes with this gas regulator, which this regulator is made in China, but it's made with all brass components. I've never had a problem with it. It's always worked flawlessly for me. Which, I mean, I don't really have anything to compare it to, but it's worked just fine for me. While we're at the back side of the machine, it's important that we note the duty cycle. So one of the drawbacks of this machine compared to a machine double or triple its cost is the duty cycle. What is the duty cycle? Well, the duty cycle is basically the percentage that you can use the machine over a period of time. All right, for example, on 115 volts, the duty cycle is 20%. So if we were to run this machine for 10 minutes, we could only use this machine for 2 minutes, and then we'd have to let it cool down for 8 minutes. That's a 20% duty cycle. Also, on 230 volt, the duty cycle goes up 10%. You have 30% duty cycle. So if we use this machine for 10 minutes, technically we can only use it for 3 minutes, and then we're supposed to let it cool down for 7 minutes. I can tell you that I pushed it way past that. But something I've started to notice, if you start to push it too much, you can actually tell the quality of the welds begin to deteriorate. The machine doesn't have as much oomph. The welds aren't as, they're not welding as nice. So it's kind of a feel thing. But normally you can pretty easily tell when you've hit that duty cycle, and all you got to do is just crack a beer and let the machine cool down for a little bit. But again, if you want to start investing in a higher quality MIG welder, you're going to get those higher duty cycles, but you're going to be paying a premium for it. For the backyard mechanic like me, this machine is plenty fine. On the right side of the machine, really nothing going on here. Of course, you have your handle up top. It hasn't broke off yet. 9 feet 6 inches. The ground clamp is about 10 feet. Alright, so now let's talk about some other things I don't like. One thing I don't like is the length of your MIG cord. This comes in at 9.5 feet, and the grounding clamp comes in at about 10 feet. Now, 9.5 feet seems like a decent length, right? Well, maybe for most people, yes, but I've at times done welding repairs on dump trucks, and let me tell you, this doesn't get me far enough. I wish this was 15 feet. I know there's probably cords that you could buy, longer cords, but I mean, out of the factory, I really wish this came with a 15-foot cord. It would make a big difference. In addition to that, this grounding clamp really should be like another 5 feet long. And the reason I say that, when it comes to finding a good grounding location, oftentimes, in my experience, especially working on like big trucks or like a big surface or something like that, there's not a spot where I could clamp this on in the area where I'm welding. So oftentimes you have to find a spot, grind off a spot, and you need like an extra foot or two to clamp this grounding clamp on. Now you can do some tricks, such as taking a bolt, holding it on here, holding the bolt against the surface, and then welding it on that way. But in my opinion, this grounding cord should be like 4 feet longer. But of course, then the cost of the machine would go up a little bit, which I'd be fine with. if you buy a MIG welder, definitely buy a high quality extension cord. I got a 25 footer here. I use this all the time. I couldn't do half the repairs I do without that extension cord. So let's continue talking about the heads here. First thing I want to talk about the grounding clamp. Now, they do use good quality cable. This is some nice stranded copper cable, but just this clamp, I mean, it's stamped and folded metal. It's a real cheap clamp. I know I could invest the money and buy like a higher quality brass clamp, but you know, then I'd have nothing to complain about, right? So this was always bending back and forth, so I just took a little zip tie. I'm surprised it hasn't burnt off yet, but that's just to kind of prevent those wires from breaking. You could see that some of those wires had broke just from the constant like back and forth motion of this. It wouldn't be that hard to replace this cord with a longer cord, but again, then I'd have nothing to complain about. So let's talk about the welding head. It is plastic, but let me tell you, this has held up to a lot of abuse. Trigger has always worked just fine. I actually bought a new aftermarket welding cup, and this has been working out fine. You can buy these aftermarket just fine. So how does this actually work? Well, you have the hollow cord, or well, you have this hollow feeder line. And as mentioned earlier, there's a few things that happen there. For one, in the middle of the cord, you have the wire, and this is where the wire feeds out. Now you do have a tip up here, and oftentimes if you find that your wire isn't feeding out properly, well, you probably had your tip too close to the work, and you probably got some splatter in your wire tip there, and it probably got all clogged up and frozen there. So good idea to buy some extra tips, some tip cleaners, but that's just something to watch for. That just threads right in the head. But the other important thing about the head is you have these little holes right here. You see those holes? So those holes are for when you're using solid core wire, which, as you can see, I do have solid core wire on this right now. But those holes are for the shielding gas. So the gas then just comes out those holes, goes through the cup, and then the cup just kind of forms a little shield of gas around your weld. And if you don't use shielding gas with solid core wire, it's just not going to work. And of course, make sure you're on the right polarity. But I gotta say, this head has held up quite well. It's taken a lot of drops. I've never had to tighten anything up, and it's nice that they added this little spring right here, which really prevents this from like damaging this cord. Again, you really got to treat this cord like an umbilical cord. Alright, maybe I went too much into like an overview of the welder, but I felt like it was really important that I go over all aspects of the welder, especially if you're thinking about purchasing this, because I think they're still for sale. I think they're still out there, and it's a good product. I think Hobart is actually owned by Miller, but with this machine they probably take like a Miller-matic and then they just put some cheaper components inside to make the duty cycle a little bit lower, and you know, it's a cheaper price point product. You know, of course, if you're looking for those higher duty cycles, obviously you're going to be spending a lot more money. But if you're like the home body mechanic like me, every now and then you're welding on a trailer or a dump truck or something like that, you just need something to kind of do it all, and you're not concerned about like production duty cycle. Like if you're working in a factory, obviously you need something with a higher duty cycle. But for the home body mechanic, this has been an absolutely incredible purchase. No complaint. Well, I do have some small complaints. Of course, I'd like that cord longer. I wish they used some higher quality components. But, you know, they got to meet that price point. And you can do some upgrades. Cool thing about this welder, too, you can get a spool gun for it. I thought about getting the spool gun for years, but it's like an extra $300. And I think when it comes to welding aluminum, I think you have to have a different shielding gas. If I'm not mistaken, I almost say that you want to use helium. I could be wrong on that, but I almost want to say you got to use helium or something like that. Which you can weld aluminum with this too. How cool is that? And that multi-voltage plug, that was really what sold me on this machine the first time. Again, like being able to take this machine, carry it in the house, it's heavy as hell, but being able to weld that fireplace flue flapper, I mean, how else was I going to fix that? There was no way that 220 plug was going to reach all the way into the house. So having the ability to go from 230 to 115 is just such a valuable feature on this unit. And that's a review. I'd be happy to answer any other questions you have, but just great welder.